So human potential has frailty and it also has immense capacity. I think here you're going to hear from somebody who has transmuted transformation of adversity into opportunity. He's turned personal tragedy into a value for not just his individual family, but the whole human family. So let's have a warm welcome for Azim.
No.
Good afternoon, greetings, and namaste. I thought I'd be safe with that, being with so many immigrants in the room, including myself. Thank you again for the honoring me as an awardee. I'm truly privileged and honored to be in your company. And I've written 4 books, and I thought I might open my conversation with you today with a quote I wrote soon after I lost Tariq. And it goes like this: "There's nothing quite so painful as a broken heart. There's nothing quite so painful as a broken heart, but a broken heart is an open heart. If one can learn to live with an open heart, gentle transformations begin to happen." So part of my goal today is to open your hearts. I know we are a group of people that are doing amazing work in the world, that they do have open hearts. But there's no limit to how much you can open your hearts. Because I think we live in a society which is very quick to judge. And I think it takes a close heart to judge. And having done this work for 20 years now, I can tell you that the biggest impediment to forgiveness is judgment. I work very, very hard to keep my heart open, because an open heart can transmit and receive empathy, compassion, and love more freely, and those are the prerequisites for forgiveness. Now, I didn't do this work when my son was alive. I worked as an international investment banker. I grew up in Kenya and was educated in England, and actually moved to the United States to escape the violence of Idi Amin in Uganda. I'm sure most of you know that story. So it was very ironic that Tariq actually was killed on a street in a country that I had picked for him. He was a great kid. He was a student at San Diego State University, and he worked on weekends as a pizza delivery man. He was lured to a bogus address by a youth gang. There was 4 of them. 3 of them were 14-year-old. The leader of the gang was an 18-year-old. And they gave the address of an apartment building with the wrong apartment number, so he knocked on many doors and came back to his car. And as he was about to leave the scene of the crime, he was accosted by those 4 young men. And the 18-year-old handed a 9mm handgun to a 14-year-old. And as my son was trying to back out of the driveway, gave the order, "Bust him bones." And it's a gang initiation ritual. And the 14-year-old fired 1 round, which entered my son's body. He was in the driver's seat under the left shoulder blade, traveled across the upper part of his body. And the bullet actually exited from his right armpit, but it was fatal. As the coroner told me, the bullet followed a perfect path. A perfect path, I queried. I thought that was an interesting choice of words. He was very quick to tell me, he says, "I'm not trying to be insensitive, Mr. Khamisa. We do not see a path like this very often." And what it means in my lingo, it destroyed all the vital organs in your son's body. And Tariq died drowning in his own blood a couple of minutes later over a lousy pizza at the age of 20. The sudden, senseless death of an innocent, unarmed human being. The total confusion as you try to absorb a new, hideous reality. And even though this tragedy happened 20 years ago, those early days are etched deeply on my heart, on my mind, and my soul. And one of the hardest things I ever had to do in my life was to call his mother. I live here. She lived in Seattle, Washington, so it's a long ways. How do you tell a mother she's never going to see her child again or hear him laugh or give him a hug? How do you do that? Tariq had a very special relationship with his mom. I too have a very special relationship with my mother. I'm sure many of you can relate. And it took me a while. And eventually, when I did tell her what happened to Tariq, she let out this loud, piercing shriek as she hit the floor. I could actually hear her hit the floor on the telephone, and I finished a very broken conversation with one of her brothers. Thank God she was not there by herself. And I share this story often, even with kids in schools. You saw that on the video. Why? Because it is painful. There's only one reason why I do that, because sometimes you don't know how painful violence is till it crosses your path. At least I didn't. But now, I really get how painful violence is. And because I really get how painful violence is, I would never in my life be violent to another human being. And I think it is important that we all get it, because there's way too much violence in our world. The United States is a terrible role model when it comes to violence. We are by far the worst role model when it comes to violence in the world. And that's not a good thing, because being the superpower, the richest nation in the world, we have a tremendous impact on the global culture. There's a lot of good things in here. I'm not knocking the US. I love my country, as many of you do too. But when it comes to violence, we are definitely a very poor role model. Now, Henry David Thoreau said, it's not important what you look at. What is important is what you see. So what I saw in this tragedy is that there are victims on both ends of the gun. I saw that my son was a victim of the 14-year-old gang member, and the 14-year-old gang member was a victim of society. Well, that begs the question, who is society? I would say American society. And societies, in my humble opinion, just don't happenstance. I think every one of us who is an American is responsible for the society we've created. I'm also a first-generation American citizen, but I am American. And I felt that as an American, I must take my share of the responsibility for the bullet that took my son's life, because it was fired by an American child. Now, you could take the position that he killed my one and only son. I have a beautiful daughter. Thank God he was not my only child, because I have met many, many parents who have lost an only child, which would be much harder. But he was my only son. And I recognize that hanging the young man on the highest pole is not going to bring my son back. Who's the enemy here? Is it the 14-year-old, or is it the societal pressures that force many young men in our country to fall through the crack? And the statistics are horrific. I don't have a long time to talk about it, but 9 months after Tariq died, I decided to create the Azim Khamisa Foundation. And our mission is to stop kids from killing kids by breaking the cycle of youth violence, and essentially have 3 mandates. First and foremost is to save lives of children. We lose way too many on a daily basis. Newtown, Connecticut, 5, 6, 7-year-olds were gunned down in machine gun fire. What are machine guns doing on our street? This is not the front line of a war zone. Our second mandate is to empower the right choices so the kids do not fall through the crack. And our third mandate is to teach the principles of nonviolence, of empathy, of compassion, of forgiveness, of peacemaking. Because violence is a learned behavior. No child was born violent. If you accept that as a truism, then nonviolence can also be a learned behavior. Where do our kids learn nonviolence? They learn it from us, from our story and the work we're doing, the Azim Khamisa Foundation. And having done this work for 20 years, we've created what we call a safe school model. So it's a live assembly. We are introduced. This man's grandson killed this man's son. And they are together in the spirit of compassion and forgiveness. I would never have met the grandfather had Tony not killed Tariq. We're different. He's African-American, although I always tell him, please, I'm the African-American in this group, not you. I was born in Africa, you are not. He's Christian, and I'm Muslim. And we've been together for 20 years, and he's as committed to this work as I am. And we'll continue doing this work for the rest of our lives, or as long as we can do it. And it's a very powerful image of them seeing both of us together. We have an in-classroom curriculum on restorative practices. We have after-school groups that lead to violence, gangs, guns, teen pregnancy. We have service learning projects. And what we find is that between 8 and 12% of these kids are the challenging kids. And we take those kids and hook them up with our mentors. And in 3 years, we can take the school and turn it totally around, get rid of the gangs. We cut suspensions and expulsions by 70%. So it puts the dent into that school to prison pipeline. And what is giving me a lot of hope is that not only these principles of nonviolence are teachable, our kids are hungry for them. So with the grace of God, the foundation just celebrated its 20th anniversary a couple of weeks ago. Thank you. And we have created a solution, at least on the prevention side of youth violence. 5 years after the tragedy, I went to meet the young man who killed my son. He's 35 years old now. His birthday was September the 22nd. I met him when he was 19 years old. Because I understood at some point I had to come eyeball to complete my journey of forgiveness. Not easy to do. You know, after all, he pulled the trigger on my son. I'd known the grandfather for a good 4.5 years. I told him, I want you to go with me, but I need some alone time with Tony because he was the last person to see my son, and there were some holes in the story. But if you're there, he'll be more defensive. So grandfather was very gracious. He left Tony and me to talk man to man for an hour and a half. And at one point, I was just sitting very close to him across the coffee table. At one point in our conversation, we locked eyeballs. I'm looking at his eyes and he's looking at my eyes. And we held that glance for a very long time. And I'm looking in his eyes trying to find a murderer. I didn't. I was able to climb through his eyes and touch his humanity. That I got that the spark in him was no different than the spark in me or anybody in this room. I was not expecting that. He was remorseful. He was articulate. He was well-mannered, a likable kid. I was not expecting that. In my third book called The Secrets of the Bulletproof Spirit, which was published by Random House, there's a chapter in there which was inspired by my meeting Tony called Real Eyes with Real Eyes. Sometimes there's way too much judgment in these eyes. You have to actually use the eyes of your soul. Tony's not a bad kid. He made a very bad choice. There's nothing worse than taking a life of an unarmed, innocent human being. There's nothing worse than that. But he's not a bad boy. At that point, I told him, Tony, not only have I forgiven you, and I knew that, my forgiveness had a lot to do with his redemption, because I truly believe he wants to turn the clock back. I wish he could, but obviously that can't happen. So I told him, Tony, at that point, that not only have I forgiven you, I want you to know that when you come out of prison and we finally have a date in 2018, you can come work with your grandfather and me. You have a job waiting for you at the Azim Khamisa Foundation. And the next day, the grandfather called me and said to me, that meeting you had with Tony was very transformative. Prior to you meeting him, he would tell me, Daddy, because he lived with his grandfather and called him Daddy, Daddy, I'm not going to make it in prison. I'm going to die. Think about it. He's a young, good-looking, charismatic boy in an adult prison. And I don't have to tell you what our adult prisons are like. I'm not going to make it in prison. I'm going to die in prison. But he said, after you met him, he totally turned around. And as you were leaving, he looked at me and said, Daddy, that's a special man. I killed his one and only son. He's not only forgiven me, he's offered me a job. I'm not worthy of his forgiveness, and I'm not worthy of his job, but I'm going to try. He aced his GED in prison at the 94.5 percentile. He's 12 units away from his first degree in child psychology. I wrote 4 books. My first was From Murder to Forgiveness, followed by Forgiveness to Fulfillment, because the work I've done in the aftermath of my son's tragedy has been very fulfilling. And I just completed the trilogy, which is From Fulfillment to Peace. And Tony wrote the foreword to that book and did an amazing job. He's a good writer. He writes poetry. And I can't wait to have him join us. Think about the power of him on stage with his grandfather and me. And he's looking at kids and telling them, when I was 11, I joined a gang. When I was 14, I killed Mr. Khamisa's son. I have been in prison for umpteen years. I'm here to tell you it's not worth it. Do you think the kids will listen to that voice? Absolutely, because his intonations will be of a person that actually pulled the trigger. And that, my brothers and sisters, is the power of forgiveness. I know we've saved Tony, but the more important thing is he will save tens of thousands of other kids when he leaves the prisons and joins his grandfather and me in this work. So let me end with another quote, which was inspired by the 9/11 tragedy. It's also the basis of my last book called From Fulfillment to Peace. Because I can tell you, the decision I made 20 years ago to forgive Tony rather than go the other way, I look back at this 20 years and it has been an amazing journey. Sure, I've talked to, I've given over 1,000 school presentations, million kids, helped a lot of people around the world. But I feel the biggest spiritual growth has been in me. That I am at a level of peace today that I don't ever remember being. Not that I don't want my son back. Obviously, I would want him back in a New York second, but that's not possible. So the choice I made 20 years ago was very much the right choice for me because it was very dark. It started with murder. First book ended with forgiveness, and then the work has been really fulfilling. And I often say I'm an investment banker who's now a social worker. And my next line is I look at that as a step up in my career. Because that was about money. This is about saving lives of children, which is far more fulfilling. And fulfillment to peace. But after 9/11, I went into this very introspective space. I know 9/11 is heavy on everybody's heart, whether they are Americans or people that live in other parts of the world. It's a little bit heavier on my heart because I'm a practicing Muslim, and the perpetrators were from my faith. I can assure you the same faith helped me to get to forgiveness, so it's not the faith. All faith teach forgiveness and compassion and, it's politics, and that's a separate conversation. But I stayed in that introspection for about 6 months. And then what came through, I meditate a couple hours a day, what came through is this quote, which is the basis of my last book. And it goes like this: sustained goodwill creates friendship. And now that ought to be obvious. You don't make friends by bombing them, right? You make friends by extending goodwill. So it starts there. Sustained goodwill creates friendship. Sustained friendship creates trust. Sustained trust creates empathy. Sustained empathy creates compassion. Sustained compassion creates peace. So I call that my peace formula. Goodwill, friendship, trust, empathy, compassion, peace. But people ask me, how do you extend forgiveness? How do you extend goodwill to the person who murdered your child? And I tell them, you do that through forgiveness. As it's evident, it worked for me. It worked for my family. What I believe is a miracle. It worked for him, and it worked for his family. It can work for you and your families. Indeed, it can work for Israel and Palestine, Syria, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq. It can work for the United States of America. Indeed, it can work for the world. So let me leave you with this thought. My sisters and brothers, peace is possible. How do I know that? Because I am at peace. And thank you again for honoring me.